Welcome back to another episode of FPO Angie, Financial Planning for Oil and Gas Professionals. This week on the podcast, we are going to review Bill Perkins' book, Die with Zero. I think it's such a provocative stage. I think we need to start by setting the context. Then we'll talk about things we liked, things we didn't like, takeaways for our listeners, and then personal takeaways for ourselves. But Justin, I think we need to acknowledge before we even get into this, you and I can't remember the podcast, but we talked about how it was near impossible. You used like the baseball analogy of talking about dying with zero, right? Like timing, understanding, okay, investment returns, your actual, like when do you die, what the sequence of returns looks like, your spending over time. Dying with zero is pretty much an impossible task, right?
It's a completely impossible task. You cannot do it, and you need to apply that idea in somewhat of a careful manner. It all comes down to income planning, sequence of return risk, longevity of a portfolio. But we can read this book, we can get super in the weeds, we can pick it apart. We can also read this book and apply some of the high-level ideas, which are fantastic. And we can do some of both. And so to answer your question, and the author admits this too, you cannot do it.
Yeah, this book is provocative, right? And I think it pushes you to an extreme. And I wouldn't, I don't know, I might challenge that extreme is healthy, but I think most retirement people exist on another extreme where they've oversaved and they've underspent, right? So like moving you more in that direction, I think is a helpful exercise. Context really matters, right? Because like this guy, Bill Perkins, net worth, I Googled his net worth, about over $100 million. And, I'm sure that fluctuates and I don't know how much of that's liquid or illiquid, but this guy is worth a substantial amount of money. And so like there's a translation issue, like dying with zero, when you have that much of a buffer might be a little disingenuous or we might need to right size that recommendation for the average oil and gas retiree.
I don't think I knew before I read this book that Bill Perkins was effectively a natural gas trader in Houston. And he does talk about John Arnold, who is, arguably the most famous commodity trader of all time, or one of them, certainly, and significant Houston roots as well. So interesting to get the oil and gas Houston tie there.
Yeah. And like I could see a segment of our audience hearing die with zero and just thinking that's outlandish and kind of agreeing with our podcast. We talked about how logistically improbable that is. It's also interesting, right, Justin, because before he was trading natural gas, he was an engineer by trade. So it's interesting his take on this, because like we see, if you think about like an engineer and a lot of the engineers we interact with, very risk-minded, very Monte Carlo sensitive, like high understanding, margin of safety kind of people. He's applied the engineering framework to think about what does marginal utility of dollars look like, right? So I think it is important to remember that like this guy has an engineer's mind. So it's not just like whimsical feelings like, hey, I think you should do this. It's a nice idea. He does kind of talk through the numbers, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Justin, any other context or table setting you feel like we should set before we start talking about specific ideas we did or didn't like in the book?
I think that really covers it. I'm excited to dive in. This book has been recommended, Jared, by how many clients of ours? And it's been so popular, especially kind of in Houston oil and gas world, I feel like. So I'm excited to dive into it.
Yeah, to bring it back to our clients, I think our audience, there's a lot we can learn because, right, it's like there's a lot of good nuggets and a lot of good takeaways for people that are frugal and risk-minded and then whose savings exceed financial independence. I think this book in the hands of a millennial that's under saving for their retirement today and just kind of adopted the YOLO mentality, this book is dynamite, right? It's literally just going to take everything they're doing and amplify its damage. This book, some of the ideas are really important. It's all about being in the right place to hear it, but I think our audience is in a perfect place to hear this message.
Great point.
All right. So Justin, what did you like about this book? What were some of the most important ideas that you think our listeners can take away from it?
Be aware, be intentional with how you spend your time and money. I like, if you love coffee, buy really nice coffee, but do understand what that trade-off is. So there's not a right or wrong answer in how you spend your money, but have an awareness of how you're spending and have an intentionality in the way that you're allocating every dollar in your life. One line that he used a lot was, your life is the sum of your experiences. And so having kind of an intentionality and a purpose of what kind of life you're building, super helpful. Really, really good thoughts there.
Yeah. He said being intentional with money is not saving on autopilot or spending on autopilot. Right. And so like that's like a great framework of like, why are you spending what you're spending, but also why are you saving the amount that you're saving, right? Like if you've already hit your financial independence number by leaps and bounds, you're kind of unnecessarily saving for some future, right? He talks about this idea in the book of like indefinitely delayed gratification. If you've already hit your number, why not use that? And if people are going to inherit that, great. We'll talk about it here in a minute, but there might be a better time to give them that inheritance. So Justin, I love that idea. And, Ramit Sethi talks about that in his book, just being ruthlessly frugal on things you don't get enjoyment out of and being frivolous on things you do. What else did you like about this book?
One of the points you made, I think this was John Arnold. And so this is a quote from the book. And I believe John was telling the author this: once I make $15 million, if I am still trading, punch me in the face. So again, that was $15 million, who I think this was John Arnold who said this. Correct me if I heard it wrong, listeners. John Arnold obviously went on to have billions of dollars. So he did go way past that number, which is interesting. Let's see. I also liked his call out that the author said investment advisors or just investment gurus. He even said Warren Buffett wants you to compound wealth. So a lot of the advice, a lot of their thoughts are around compounding wealth. Jared, he repeated this over and over and over. The author would say, I want you to live an awesome life. His goal is not for you to compound wealth endlessly. His goal was for you to live the best life.
Yeah. And I like kind of what you said about compounding wealth endlessly, right? And like with no aim, right? So I would say that's saving on autopilot for some unknown future thing that you haven't set any intention around. Yeah, I love that idea. Justin, one of the things, kind of getting back to what you were talking about the trading and, saying, hey, if I ever get to $50 million, punch me in the face. So I'm loosely re-saying that quote. He did a lot of good of questioning continuation of working. Right. And he talks about, hey, if you've already hit your financial independence number, like, why are you continuing to work? And I think he acknowledges this reality of like, there's so much cultural affirmation and support for continuing to make money that you might just, again, getting back to autopilot, you might just continue to do that. You're managing people, you feel good, you're getting compensated at work, you're getting new compensation, new responsibilities, new challenges, right? So there's so much cultural affirmation in doing that and support and a positive feedback loop that you might just do that endlessly. And not endlessly, maybe longer than you might anticipate or that might be helpful to you. And there might be diminishing returns on how individually fulfilling the money might be to you, right? Especially if you're just kind of saving on autopilot.
Absolutely. It is interesting. We've played golf with a few guys over the last several months who trade natural gas, and whether it's them or people around them, there are folks in that realm of work that are just hitting incredible amounts of wealth. There's two things I noticed. One is that even if you hit 8 or even if you hit 9 figures, and obviously John Arnold hit 10 figures, so you can get really high up there. They can't really stop or turn it off. It's very hard to do what John Arnold said in this book of punch me in the face if I hit 15 million and I'm still trading. Maybe that's kudos to Nathan. Jared, maybe we need to really appreciate Nathan's ability to follow through and actually change careers from what he was previously doing. Second thing, it's also kind of funny that my immediate instinct when I hear some of these stories and have some of these conversations is that I don't know if we would necessarily want them as clients, which is nonsensical. I mean, we run a wealth management investment advisory firm for oil and gas folks. So why in the world would we not want a natural gas trader with 9 figures or more? But sometimes it just doesn't line up. So yeah, it's very difficult, just like you said, to be pursuing something with such fervor. And it can be really difficult to turn that off and to understand when should you turn it off. What does turning it off even look like? So there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah. And doing the hard work of like acknowledging why you're having difficulty turning it off.
Yeah.
right? Like it's tough. Like work is such a big part of who we are. But yeah, I mean, good for Nathan leaving the lucrative natural gas world to join a small little boutique RIA that's growing. He's definitely getting closer to the goal of dying with zero in that scenario. But right, like it's a great example of like not optimizing, right? Really kind of what you touched on. It's really tough managing energy traders that are just needlessly compounding because like they're never going to enjoy it. Right. And then there's always more that can be accumulated. If you're just excessively saving, like managing that portfolio is really easy because there's like no, like there's minimal withdrawal rates, but it's not exactly fun, right? Like as a financial planner, one of the things that gets us excited is helping people use their money to live a meaningful life, right? And somebody that's just needlessly compounding indefinitely in the future and working a demanding job that they don't really like but feel like they should be working, that's not fun for them, and that's not fun for us from a planning perspective. We get much more excited about helping people. Hey, how do I optimize the nest egg that I built intentionally?
It's funny, as you were saying this, it hit me that I've had several conversations with natural gas traders in their 30s or 40s who openly say, I plan to be financially independent within 5 years, and I plan to be retired or doing something much more calm. But then on the other side of that equation, I've also talked to multiple of those guys that are now in their 50s, do have incredible net worths, and they haven't stopped yet. So it is really hard to turn it off.
Yeah. I mean, that gets to another thing that I really liked in this book of like talking about understanding the time horizons of spending, right? He had a great chart that showed your different balance of health, time, and money, right? And like early in your 20s, you don't really have, you have, tons of time and tons of health, but not much money. 30 to 60, you have a decent balance kind of all three of those. And then, after your 60s, you have a lot of time and you have a lot of money, but you don't have a lot of health, right? So that should really change your sequence of how do I think about big expenses, right? Like if you were to build a bucket list, like and one of your things is like heli skiing in Japan, man, you should probably do that sooner rather than later because health is, something that deteriorates over time. So like you might have more money later, but your health isn't going to allow you to do the demands of enduring jet lag, being on a helicopter, doing intense backcountry skiing, right? There's a finite amount of time and you might not have, all the money you need to live the life you want, but hey, this thing, if it's really important to you, it has a shelf life, and beginning to bucket and think about spending and creating experiences based on that framework versus just, hey, can I afford this today and in the future?
Absolutely. So important to be intentional. And something we've talked about in other episodes, understanding what assets and wealth are, that money is a part of it, but money is not your only asset. So good to have an awareness of that.
Yeah, and he talks about this, right? Like he said, like your life's kind of like the summation of all the experiences you have. If you think about legacy, then it's like legacy is a function of experiences with your children. So if you think about legacy in that definition, if you are working endlessly, you're to save for your children's legacy, you might actually be depleting it because that work is time you aren't spending with your family, right? And we're not saying, hey, go from working 60 hours a week to not working at all. I think that's really tough to do, but it is a trade-off you're making, right? And if you reframe, okay, what is my legacy? My legacy is the experiences and wisdom I impart to my kids, then it might change how you think about, how long you save for and how much of your savings is earmarked for legacy if you have kind of a more holistic view of what that means.
Absolutely.
Awesome. What else did you like, Justin?
I really liked his thoughts on inheritance. Part of them were challenging. A lot of his thoughts, not part of them, almost all of his thoughts on inheritance, Jared, in my opinion, go against so much of the advice that we give as planners. So if you're doing great multi-generational planning, that will often lend itself to irrevocable trust that may not be completely liquid for children until they hit a certain age. And that age is a lot older than his ideal age that people would inherit money. So I really liked his thoughts on inheritance. And I feel like we could break down a lot of what he said in that section.
Yeah. There's a few big benefits to giving money early on, right? Like you as the gifter gets to see the gift, right? Like your utility of giving that money is greater, right? Because it's not something that you give away when you pass away. you give away, like, and you get to see the benefits of it. I loved that idea. And then in terms of marginal utility, like the Federal Reserve data says that, that he quotes in here says the average age of inheritance is 60. But if you think about where the average person in their 60 is, that's like their highest income earning years. So let's not adjust for inflation and say you're set to inherit $50,000 from a distant relative. Let's even inflation adjust it. Does $50,000 in your late 20s, early 30s, would you take that? How much of a difference would that make in your life versus $100,000 in your highest earning years in your mid 50s, right? And I think that's just like such a powerful example and illustration of, hey, you want to make sure that the inheritor who is getting the assets is responsible and that it's timely and that it's thoughtful, and you want to delay gratification. So it's a balance. But I do appreciate his idea of just challenging us to say, hey, money makes a disproportional impact on somebody in their late 20s, early 30s versus getting it in their peak earning years. So like if you have plans to leave a financial legacy, which is great, consider how you might do that. And if waiting till the arbitrary time of you passing away is really the best time to do that.
Jared, I'm glad you brought that up. I want to dial in on that Federal Reserve data. So he shared a few things that I want to repeat here. Again, Federal Reserve says that the median person who's inheriting money, kind of the middle of that bell curve, is a 60-year-old. So Bill Perkins highlighted that point, and he actually said, I don't have the Federal Reserve data, so I don't know if this is completely true, but I believe this is a pure quote from the book. Bill Perkins said that the same amount of people are inheriting money at age 80 who are inheriting money at age 40. And so that's pretty powerful. It was also interesting for Bill, the author, to give his own thoughts on this. I was challenged and surprised, but then the more I thought about it, I kind of agreed with him. Jared, he said that the ideal age to inherit is 26 to 35. And he said that is drastically more helpful. It's more impactful. It's more of a blessing than inheriting money at 58. And he went on to say that 58 is way too old to be able to fully capture the blessing that is inheriting money. So that was challenging to me, Jared, because the vast majority of families we work with, inheritance events are after 58. They're not before. And Bill Perkins is saying, hey, 58 is way too late. So this idea, I mean, it truly goes so far against and so, so much in the opposite direction of what a huge amount of estate and financial planning does today and how most people pass down money.
Yeah, but I mean, you got to be thoughtful about it, right? Because you don't want to jeopardize your own future. So it's all about like bucketing and doing the hard work of thinking through, okay, what exactly do I need and what do I have upcoming? And, moving into this involves a decent amount of strategy. You can't just say, oh, okay, I'm aligning with this. I'm going to give them everything that I anticipate to give them in the future today, right? Like doesn't really account for sequence of returns risk and, uncertainty about your financial future. So you still got to be thoughtful there.
Yeah, Jared, I really kind of struggle because I see both ends. On the one hand, I really think about me, just my experience. I'm 36 now. And I would kind of say that I'm glad I didn't have any sort of big nest egg at 25 because, I mean, my goodness, I think at 28, I would have very different thoughts than I had at 25. I think at 32, I would have different thoughts than I had at 28. And now at 36, I have different thoughts than all of those ages. And frankly, I think how I would handle it is continuing to get better, not worse. And so there's kind of this trade-off of, there is an enormous amount of help and impact that can happen with a younger gifting. But then it's also so easy to just think, well, why don't we make the age 35 or 40? Because kids are likely going to be more mature at that stage.
Yeah. Here's the great thing about setting an intention of gifting earlier, you get flexibility, right? Like, because if you put it all in a trust, like a trust is going to govern how it's distributed. Right. And each kid is different. How they develop may be different. The timing, their needs, their current job might be different. So it gives you some flexibility to kind of course correct along the way. Right. I don't think what Bill Perkins is advocating is, hey, in this window, give them everything they're ever going to get. And maybe he's advocating for that. But I think more realistically, it's like, hey, over that season, think about strategically accelerating gifting. And
Yeah.
like, I think that framework might be different for each kid, might be different depending on your net worth at that time. And you might, equalize the estate later to kind of reconcile that. But I do think just the spirit of, hey, this season is a more valuable season. How do I take advantage of the season versus, hey, you hit the 26 year, you're 26 now. Here's everything I was going to give you.
Great point.
One of the things I also really liked is his idea of memory dividends. I love this idea because if you think about your life is the summation of your experiences, like worthwhile experiences are investments, right? Like it's not just consumption at one point in time. Like those things pay dividends, right? Not in a monetary form, but in the form of memories, right? And those make a meaningful difference on your life. So like the idea of like splurging on worthwhile experiences, it's not just present consumption. Your experiences become investments when you think about, right, the memories that you're accumulating that you'll get to marinate on and that make life rich as you're sitting around the fire telling stories.
Great point. What a good thought. It's almost like that is currency. Memories and experiences are currency, and they should be valued and pursued as such.
So good.
Another subtopic with that point, he did a really good job of highlighting that, hey, memories are age restrictive. There are memories that you cannot have. And obviously, he pointed out memories you can't have at 65, 75, 85, 95. But he even pointed out that this was in the idea that you actually have many deaths in life. One of the ones he mentioned was you do have a death of when you get out of your kids being an infant stage. And so that is a memory that is done for many people at 30, 35, 40, 45, somewhere in that 15-year window, depending on when you have kids. So memory dividends, powerful idea, and the idea that, hey, there is a timeline that runs out on that for everyone.
All right, Justin, anything else you liked before we get into things maybe we didn't like as much?
One quick question for you, Jared. Are you kind of ready to get out of baby stage?
Yeah, it's tough because like Ellis is the time of recording this, he's like 13 months. And so he's really starting to come alive. And like he's a very needy kid, still waking up a ton in the night and all that stuff. But like anything, it's a balance, right? Like I'm kind of ready to get out of it, but I also really love it and cherish it. And it's just been such special time. So I'm conflicted, but it's a day by day, it changes. I would say, hey, get me out of here ASAP. And then I'll remember that, hey, once I get out of here, I'm going to look at this so longingly. So, like any parent of a very young kid, there's days you never want it to end and days you wish it would end sooner.
That's really well put. Yeah, for our youngest, Peter is now 6. So we have 3 kids. Peter is our third, and we have tried, extensively to have more kids, and does not appear to be in the Lord's will that we do so. With Peter, we just lament. I mean, we are so sad when different growth stages happen. His front teeth are loose right now. And my wife, Lauren, is just, on the verge of losing it because she cannot handle the fact that would happen. And that's happened at every growth stage for Peter. But then there's also this other side that every next stage that he gets to is so fun to see. And that's true with all of the kids. Great point, though, that you really do need to cherish those memories.
Awesome. Well, what didn't you like about the book? Or I guess, what do you have qualms with?
Yeah. So, few things that we can cover here. I think I want to say this with a caveat. At times I was thinking this guy has got to be paid by some sort of life insurance company. It was kind of an annuity commercial there for a good chunk of the book. So didn't always love that. Long-term care, huge long-term care advocate. I think there's a lot of reasons to be, I won't say skeptical, but I would say very fair and balanced when you consider whether or not you need long-term care. And there's a really good chance that long-term care is just really expensive and you won't be able to capitalize on it at all. And there are other ways to manage that risk. So, Jared, I think I maybe had a qualm with how pro-annuity, pro-long-term care he was. And before getting your thoughts, I'll just give a caveat with that, he's writing this book for the general audience of tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people. Our median client is at an asset level where an annuity just doesn't make sense for them. But, if you are entering retirement, and especially kind of if you have a combination of Social Security and say $800,000, and a pretty reasonable monthly budget, there are definitely cases where an annuity is in your best interest. If you have $5 million and you're maybe spending $10,000 a month, well, then it's just not in your best interest and it's hard to make a case for it. But that would be one qualm. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I get like in the context of why he presented it, like it's intellectually consistent, right? Like if you think about why he's pro annuity, he is pro managing longevity risk, right?
Yep.
So like you can actually die with like you can die way closer to zero if you know you have a paycheck, right? One of the reasons people don't pursue the idea of dying with zero is what if I live longer than anticipated, right? It's like it's managing longevity risk. And long-term care is managing substantial future medical expense risk, right? So it's a risk management tool that gives you bucketing so that you know, like, hey, I'm earmarked, I'm good. Problem with that is like not all annuities in long-term care insurance is the same. One of my problems is like if you look at a quote from his book, he says, no amount of savings available to most people will cover the costliest care you might possibly need. And like, I would argue that with long-term care insurance, right? Like if you buy the wrong long-term care policy and there's no inflation adjustment or the inflation, or if you buy an inflation cost of living adjustment that's 2% and long-term care expenses inflate at 5%, and 30 years from now, when you need the policy, it's 4x more expensive than you thought. Like, man, that didn't help you. And some of these policies are really, really expensive, right? So it just doesn't make sense to own them, and not all policies are equal. So I think just like saying, hey, I recommend it, it's great. It's like, no. Like the variance is super wide. He also bashed AUM advisors because they have an incentive not to recommend an annuity, as though the annuity salesman has no conflict of interest. That was a pretty hot take there.
What's funny about this, and here's why I'm so kind of aghast at this whole topic. He actually said that you should pursue a fee-only advisor instead of an AUM advisor because they won't have the conflicts of interest and will be able to suggest the right annuity. So many thoughts on this. What an incredible example of how absurdly difficult it is to fully understand the landscape of investment advice today, what the fiduciary standard is, what fee-only means, what AUM means. I mean, Jared, the vast majority of fee-only advisors are AUM. I would venture to say it's over 80%. Vast majority of fee-only advisors are AUM based. So they're paid based on the assets that you give them to manage. He's saying that's a conflict of interest, so go seek out a fee-only advisor. And, I don't want to be too critical here. Bill Perkins is clearly a brilliant guy. And so I think it just highlights the absurd state of our industry and how hard it is to navigate. Okay, who is a financial advisor? Who has financial advisor on their business card, but they're actually an annuity salesperson? Who is charging in the right way? I can't tell you how many times I've heard consumers use fee-based as they think that's fee only, which is pretty scary because fee-based is literally the opposite. That is the, Merrill Lynch advisor who can say, yeah, we have a fiduciary standard, and in the exact same meeting, sell you a product that isn't necessarily in your best interest and receive a big commission for it.
Again, it just highlights how convoluted it is. But I think just saying, hey, just managing this risk, like dying with zero is not as easy as buying an annuity in a long-term care policy and calling it a day. And some of those will actually, depending on where you are on the wealth spectrum and how much of these you buy, it might hinder, you might get further from dying with zero. Right? If you buy the incorrect policy. Justin, I think another big bone I have to pick is the net worth should peak. Like he says, net worth should peak around age 50, right? Like taking the philosophical things of, hey, the marginal utility of money, you can spend it, it's better to spend it earlier while you have a decent balance of time, money, and health. I just think that's logistically improbable, and it's kind of dangerous, right? Like I think if you live to 90, if your net worth starts depleting at age 50, like how are you going to last 40 years? And what if the first decade is a lost decade in the stock market, like it was in the S&P from 2000 to 2009, right? Like there's just no accommodation for sequence of returns risk. And I think that's like that's a big potential risk. And the other thing he was quoting, he was quoting a lot of data about like how net worth can just continue to grow over people's time. The average person that was probably included in this data was, not even a millionaire, and most of their net worth was tied up in home equity, right? So like using his advice, he would recommend that people take out home HELOCs or reverse mortgages starting at age 50 and just hope that Social Security kind of covers enough. That seems, directionally, I like the idea of like getting more aggressive with gifting and all that stuff. But even, if you think about somebody retiring from oil and gas, right? Like their net worth might peak in their mid 60s or 70s because we're going to do aggressive Roth conversions, pay taxes on those. And then we're going to fund their expenses, most of their expenses from assets versus from Social Security at 70 and RMD age, right? And so like, I just don't think that gives you a lot of future optionality if your net worth peaks at age 50.
Yes. So this is probably my biggest gripe. And again, when we go through all these gripes, I loved this book. Bill Perkins just did such an excellent job. And so, we're saying these, but still a really big fan of this work. Again, that's my biggest gripe. And here's why. You truly cannot. You cannot have net worth peak at 45 to 50, like he said. It is a sequence of return risk nightmare. On the one hand, I do think the 4% rule, if you're listening to this, the 4% rule in 10 seconds has kind of been the guideline for how you withdraw your portfolio in retirement. So 4%, if you have $2 million when you retire, 4% of that is $80,000 a year. Therefore, $80,000 should be your year one withdrawal. You better be able to pay taxes, pay insurance, and live off of that number. So on the one hand, 4% is very low. When you really study historical sustainable withdrawal rates, history would say a very sustainable withdrawal rate is much closer to 6%, 6.5%, if you're doing a handful of things that support a higher withdrawal rate. And we have an episode on that. Cannot remember which number it is, but maybe we'll revisit that topic here shortly. But the 4% rule is extremely conservative and historically almost guarantees that your net worth will continue to endlessly increase. But Jared, doing what he says would effectively require, over the last 100 years, every rolling 30-year window, Jared, it would require like an 8-9% withdrawal rate at age 49, which is incredibly risky. And the problem is you can't even play this safe and maybe do it for 5 years. And as long as there's not a 4-year-long market crash in your first 5 years of retirement, maybe you'll make it. You really can't do that because then you're still going to be 54. You can't have a horrible 6-year sequence of return risk right then, or it could truly sink you if your withdrawal rate is that high. So on a practical level, the idea of having your net worth peak from 45 to 50 and making sure that you're spending more of your assets, the problem is you have no idea what the next 10, 20 years of market returns are going to be. It is effectively impossible. And that is the essence of great income planning. And so there's just not really a solution there.
Yeah. I mean, so again, remember, Bill Perkins is worth $100 million. So if we do 4% rule for Bill Perkins and he spends $1 million a year, he needs $25 million. Which means 25% of his net worth would actually be needed to fund future living expenses. So 75% is wiggle room, right? If his net worth is $100 million. So in his case, he could have his net worth peak because most of his net worth isn't needed to fund his future lifestyle. But I would argue the greater the percentage of your net worth that's needed to fund your future lifestyle, maybe you can't get as egregious in terms of when your net worth peaks.
That's right. I also would point out, I believe this book was released July 28th of 2020. I think that's what Google said. So I just want to say that the vast majority of the work done in this book was done in a pre-pandemic world. So a lot of the figures shared were much lower figures. And I say that to say, as a financial planner, retirement planning forever changed in 2020. So if you were 65, 66 before then, you could kind of what I would call play small ball in retirement. You could have a fantastic retirement, Jared, on $800,000 when you combine Social Security, maybe 2 Social Securities, maybe your expenses are paid off and you're spending $5,000 a month, and that's still a great life because you were able to buy your assets before they exploded in price. If you are 28 today and you're building your financial life and you haven't bought your house yet, you are going to need so much more than a lot of the numbers and the different examples he shares in this book.
Totally. But again, that's why remembering, hey, dying with zero is an impossible task. He's just trying to move us to be more intentional, right? And like, kind of like you're saying, like, hey, if you're a young accumulator, there's probably less you can take here than if you're a retiree that's already financially independent and is having trouble saving, right? The takeaways are going to be very different depending on who those audience are, Justin. So I'd love to kind of wrap up and say, hey, what were your biggest takeaways? And what do you think are a few of the biggest takeaways for our listeners?
My biggest takeaways personally, Jared, we've talked about this. I kind of feel like I'm already living this book. Some of our listeners may know this. A little over 6 years ago, I was diagnosed with cancer and had a pretty brutal, awful 6-month battle with cancer and was really on the edge of my life. And we found this out totally unexpected. We found out 14 days, 2 weeks after Lauren had Peter, our third child. So this, forever changed our lives. And let me put it this way. I think the simplest way to put it is if there's a question of save or spend on a family experience, Jared, we spend every time. And so I feel like I'm already living this book and I love it. I think there's kind of another element of this where, I had cancer and that kind of made us think we may not be able to have kids again. My wife ended up having, a little situation where, long story short, she cannot really have kids anymore. So we are so grateful. We feel like we got our third kid in at the buzzer. And he shares this idea that you think you're going to live forever. People think they're just never going to die. And again, he shares the idea that you have many deaths in life. I'm really glad we didn't put off having kids. If you're sitting there with 2 excellent salaries thinking, well, we got to have $1.4 million before we start a family, just have the kids. Just go. It'll all work out. And guess what? Even if it doesn't, it's probably going to be better than 2 weeks after giving birth, finding out one of you has cancer and a horrible cancer battle ahead. And so I love the book because I feel like we're already living it. And I'm so glad we are. The last 5-6 years have probably been the richest years of our lives. What was obviously one of the most difficult experiences that we could have ever imagined is probably what we're most thankful for today. Love the principles he talks about. And yeah, I think it's absolutely worth saying yes to every meaningful relationship experience you can have. Essentially using, I can't even remember the passage, but the way that Jesus puts it in the Gospels, or that you're using monetary worldly wealth to buy eternal relationships. And so I love it. Jared, how about you?
I think when you get into personal finance, the 7th wonder of the world is compound interest. You hear that idea and then you just try to aggressively save, right? And there's one point where Bill Perkins has a boss and the boss he tells his boss how much money he's saved. Like as a poor, broke trader straight out of school, first job, he told his boss how much he saved, thinking his boss was going to be impressed. And his boss was like, you idiot. You have so much opportunity to make more money and you don't make any money now. And you have a really hard demanding job. Enjoy it, right? Save a little less. And so I think I've spent so much mental energy fixated on my savings rate and how to optimize that and increase that. But I haven't actually ever played that out because I really like my work and I want to do it for a long time. So do I need to be saving as much as I'm currently saving if I plan to work as long as I do? So it's just kind of challenging to me and also affirming, right? We're taking a 3-week trip to Europe in November and it's going to be chaos with an 18-month-old at the point we're taking that trip. And, we're definitely going to be making some memory dividends. And then probably the plane ride will kind of be taking away from those dividends a little bit. But I do think
expense ratio.
There's a trade-off there. But I think the idea of especially investing in experiences, it's a really helpful framework of I'm not just not saving, I'm making this alternative investment. And so I think that framework is really encouraging and understanding the linearity of when you can take trips. Because my sister-in-law is getting married in London in October. And that kind of forced us to go to Europe. But we could have gone to Europe, but we could have also talked ourselves out of going to Europe for the next decade for reason A, for reason B, how much money it is. Oh, Ellis needs to sit in our laps. Oh, now Ellis needs his own seat. So now it's more expensive, right? So if there's an inkling of something that we feel like is really going to create positive memory dividends and meaningful experiences for our family, let's do it. And like, even if it's not financially optimal, because right, that's not the thing we're optimizing for. So I feel like we're doing a decent job of that, but it is just helpful to just help me kind of take my foot off the optimizing savings gas pedal.
That's so good. And, you mentioned a 3-week trip to Europe. That may have memory dividends, but you also have a few-week trip to Fort Worth planned. And so, London is cool, but I think Cowtown is where the memory dividends really are.
Yeah, the thriving metropolis of Cowtown. Some might even say
Right.
it's the London of North Texas.
Yeah, a lot of people are saying this. A lot of people who I respect are saying this.
Cool. Well, we loved talking about this book. We had bones to pick, but I think directionally, especially if you're one of our listeners and you have trouble not spending the money, I think there's a lot of good nuggets of wisdom. And he's on one extreme and he'll kind of pull you closer towards the middle of making sure that you're not just over saving and over accumulating without intention or on autopilot. So I'd love to hear from you, readers and listeners. What did you think of it? Are there any other books you'd like for us to review? Podcast@brownlingwealthmanagement.com. Thanks. We'll see you next time.